Acts chapter 12. Uh, let's begin at verse 1. It was about this time, okay, that's in the context of chapter 11. What we have is chapter 11, where Barnabas and Saul had been commissioned by the church at Antioch to take back their gifts to the church in Jerusalem for distribution because a famine had been prophesied and then eventually took place. All right. It was about this time, so it's almost like meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. Herod was not great as a civil servant. As a matter of fact, he was not a civil servant. He was a self-seeking egotist. There's not much I can say about Herod that is good. And here you get another glimpse into the kind of guy he was. He arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. I mean, it wasn't like he was trying to, let's have a little round table and talk about this, and let's try to make this for all of our good. And no, I'm going to round up whoever I want to, and I'm going to hurt them. Verse 2. He had James, the brother of John. Now this was James the apostle, put to death with the sword. That's pretty ultimate persecution there, right? And I can imagine that one of the things Herod was thinking is, hey, I'll show him. This is what you got to look forward to if you keep doing what you're doing. Well, he had James killed with the sword. We don't know whether that's beheaded or run through, cut in half. We don't know. I can't imagine that it wasn't excruciatingly painful. Verse 3. When he saw that this met with approval among the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. Herod didn't have a public relations team, but he knew which way the wind was blowing, and he could tell, oh, this pleased the Jews. Okay, let's go for another one of the biggies. Peter. And then Luke goes on, this happened during the festival of unleavened bread. Why is that important? Two things. The festival of unleavened bread was connected to the observation of the Passover. And for the church, the remembrance of, I'm not even going to say they celebrated it, but they certainly remembered that the resurrection of Jesus happened in that time frame as well. It was one of the primary feasts on the Jewish calendar. Another thing about that is people from all over the world would have come back to, I say all over the world, but it was all over the world, would have come back to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So there were people, there was a large crowd. I in some of my research, it was indicated that the population of Jerusalem nearly doubled during the season of Passover. So, Herod got the double whammy here, right? Or the double dip. Number one, he knew he was, garnering affection from the Jewish population. And oh, by the way, there's more of them in town now than there will be almost any other time of year. Hey. The numbers in the polls ought to go up. Well, no, not really, because there were no polls, and polls didn't matter because Herod was not elected. He was designated. Okay. This happened during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then one last thing about that is this is another one of Luke's map pins, or whatever you'd want to call it. This is a spot on the timeline. This can be verified, right? Because it's connected to events and a season, it was a big celebration, and it was another one of the verifiable facts. Okay. Verse 4, after arresting him, he put him in prison, handing him over to be guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. 16 soldiers had been commissioned and delegated to guard Peter. That indicates to me that Herod was not going to let this one get away. I wonder, I'm pretty sure that Herod had heard about an episode before where Peter had somehow miraculously escaped out of prison and showed up the next day teaching in the temple courts. He wasn't going to let that happen again. So he put him in prison. Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after the Passover. So Peter was going to be in prison for, at least a week. Well, if I could have been a fly on the wall and watching Peter, I have this sense that Peter would have thought, I don't like prison, but you know what? I've been here before. This doesn't scare me. I wish I could be that way in my own life, but I'm not. Well, regardless of Herod's taking measures, and he had a plan. He's going to bring him out after the Passover and hold a trial so that, number one, I think the reason he was going to hold a trial, he already knew what the verdict was going to be. But the reason he wanted to hold a trial is to get more of the Jews on board with him, right? This was just an opportunity to feather his nest. He was a very vain person. We're going to see that later. Okay, verse 5. So Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying to God for him. That's, if I can say this, that's a big but. The church was earnestly praying for him. There was no Facebook to get the word out on. There was no prayer chain telephoning. There was just word of mouth. And the word got back to the church. How many? Well, we don't know. The church had the last count, the last number was 5,000. And many of them would have been dispersed out into Samaria and beyond because of the persecution of the church after the martyrdom of Stephen. So I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine that the number was not still in the thousands, because even at that, the church continued to grow in Jerusalem. So anyway, the church began to pray, earnestly prayed for Peter. In verse 6. No, I can't go there yet. Let's go back. I think today in my own life, I struggle sometimes with my belief, my faith and trust that God will hear and answer my prayer. And I prayed earnestly, and it didn't go the way I had prayed. This is hard for me. I have times when I have prayed earnestly, and it went the right way, or the way I had hoped, and according to my request. Apparently, the church here earnestly prayed because they believed that God would act when they prayed. Now bear in mind, I don't want to say in a liberal theological sense that the doctrines and theology of the church were still in their evolutionary phases, and yet the teaching of the apostles had not yet been written down and codified and distributed. It was still word of mouth, and so there was no book about prayer. The book was what we have as the Old Testament. And yes, there is much in the Old Testament about prayer and the admonitions to pray, and that God will hear and answer our prayers. You know, there's this old thing that I think is valid, although old, that God answers prayer in more than one way. Sometimes he says no, for reasons that I won't understand. I asked him to heal my sister of a brain tumor, and she died. Okay, I don't understand that. But he said no, I think. Now, there's another side of that, and I don't want to burn off a lot of time with it, but the other side of it is, isn't it possible that he truly did give Sandy a final healing, because when she woke up, she was in heaven? What could be better? Okay. No. And sometimes he'll say, not yet. I don't like that as an answer. I really don't like no, and I don't like not yet. And then there are other times when he says, yeah, go. I'm going to do what you ask me to do. Now, there are times when he does what I ask him to do, but he doesn't do it in the way I had asked, right? And here's the best news on the whole idea of prayer. God already knows what's going to happen. And I can't explain this, but because of his sovereignty and his grace and his love for us, he permits us to move him, or what we sense is moving him, by our requests. Ay, caramba. Well, the church there was earnestly praying for Peter. And it doesn't say they were praying for his release. I think they were praying for his preservation, because they wouldn't have been dumb. They knew, I'm convinced, they knew that Herod intended to do to him something similar to what he had done to James. And so they were praying that God would protect him, at least. And maybe they were even praying that God would totally deliver him. Good prayers. Good prayers. Earnest prayers. I'm not going to go, we don't have time to go into what happens after they pray or as a result of their prayers, but just to say this, they prayed earnestly. I don't think anybody prays earnestly without an emotional catalyst. These were not merely intellectual and rational prayers. Earnest prayers involve passion and emotion. I don't think all of our prayers need to be emotionally charged the way I think these prayers were. No, I mean, there are times when I pray, I don't even feel like praying, but I pray. And I don't think God is in heaven going, I know what's in your heart. This doesn't even count. I don't think so. But as I'm recording this, I have a friend in Tulsa whose life is kind of hanging by a thread in the hospital, and I'm praying earnestly with emotion and passion for him. I have another friend who's recovering from yesterday. He had a triple bypass surgery in Denver, Colorado. He lives in Dallas and was visiting in Denver. I'm praying for him earnestly. These are guys I love. I have an emotional connection with, and I'm praying earnestly, but all my prayers are not earnest. The point I'm wanting to make is, my friends, pray. Pray. Yeah. Try to do better next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.